Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. I've pressed the button here that opens up the trapdoor, removes the fund managers and brings in my next guest. On the Advice Show later on today, we're going to get stuck into pensions legislation, the defined benefit sector, the latest from the FCA, from our Head of Compliance Policy, Richard Nuttall. We're going to take a look at the mortgage market and technology in the advice business. But right now, in order to critique and mark the homework of those asset managers we've just spoken to, I've got none other than Ken Rayner of Rayner Spencer Mills Research with me. Ken, thank you very much for taking the time. Let's have a think about the types of funds that we've just heard talked about, the managers of them. You are continually reviewing and rating those funds for advisors. What does it mean when a fund's given a rating?
Well, in principle, Dan, I think the core of it is that we think it's useful and sensible to give something a rating because it means that people have a belief in the quality of that fund. And that rating is basically twofold. Well, two parts of it are important. The first is the quantitative element of the rating, which is our view and filtering of all the different statistics that we use. And the second part, which in our view is the most important in terms of differentiation, which is the qualitative element of it, which we spend most of our time doing. And that element is the bit that really distinguishes it between those funds that we think should be rated and those that shouldn't be rated. Okay.
Give me a view of the two parts then. Let's talk about the quantitative aspect first then.
Sure.
Tell me about the numbers that you'd crunch and what that involves.
Well, clearly it involves two parts to it really. One is looking at risk in relation to the fund, and that means looking at the fund's volatility, its downside capture, its Sortino ratio, a whole number of ratios that we look at, including information ratio, i.e. the way in which we look at a fund from a point of view, its return relative to its risk that it takes to get there. Then there's a whole lot of performance statistics, obviously, which involve looking at rolling data, cumulative data and discrete data. So we're trying to look at it from all angles so that we know that if for example, a fund performs over a very short period of time and that statistic delivers something which it can means it's going to be its long-term performance looks good, we can look back at that and say, actually, it was a specific reason that caused that fund to do that and not necessarily the consistency of process over time. What we're trying to do is really deliver funds which we think in the active sphere anyway, deliver consistency over time and show that the manager is producing and using and creating alpha to deliver those returns.
Okay, and what's the quantification of alpha? What's seen as good return?
Well, good return is return which is over and above the return that you would get from the market, and that is really difficult to achieve. There's not very many managers that have that level of consistency across the board. And in fact, we would probably expect managers that we select, if we understand them really well, not to do that. There will be periods of time when they underperform a market simply because their particular style or way that they invest delivers different shapes of return. So, examples that we look at include the way in which style is developed within a manager, and that can include whether they offer a value style. A pragmatic style might be something that we would expect to deliver over all time periods, so something which not necessarily delivers in specific markets, but one which delivers over all times, as I said. So there's different ways in which managers look at their funds, manage their funds, and we have to interpret that. And what's really, really important is that process is really fully understood, so that when we develop a fact sheet, when we give you information as advisors, that it actually makes sense and that you can use it in the sense that it's meant to be used in, and not just simply, oh, well, that fund's performing well at the moment. If you recall, 25 years ago, we were probably looking in the back of a couple of magazines and deciding, oh, well, that looks like it's a good performing fund at the moment, let's use that. We didn't know as much about it now. And with the access that the managers give us, our ability to interpret that and provide data on it and information, particularly qualitative information, means that you've got a much better position to be in when you're selecting a fund, I think, today.
Okay. The good news is we're getting questions. And Jane Hodges is back. Hi, Jane. You're first out of the blocks again in this session. Top marks for you. For research, there's some criticism that firms are not completely independent, which is obviously important for an IFA. Can you comment on that and give a view on when this happens and when it doesn't? How independent is the research process?
Well, I think we can hark back right to when we first started doing research, which was really on the basis of a business at the time that just simply worked for IFAs, and we provided lists, we provided portfolios, we provided research to those IFA groups. prior to any rating business that we had. And I think that sort of is the development of our process. We've always looked at funds and researched them from the point of view how well they will work within portfolios and how well they will work for those people using them. And from that point, we developed a secondary business, which is ratings. Now, I think we can show that, and most ratings agencies, I think these days, don't work on a model of being paid to rate funds. That simply does not work and does not qualify as an independent research process. How we look at it is we look at the funds, we look at the data. If that data warrants us to look at a fund qualitatively, then we will go and look at it, and then we will decide whether or not we want to rate it. If that involves a fund that then doesn't wish to use our marketing logo or has no interest in engaging with Rayner Spencer Mills as a company, then that's fine. We continue to rate that fund and use it if we think it's good for a portfolio. So that's where it starts, and in some ways that's where it ends. And if the secondary part of that process, which is where our revenue comes from, and I think this is important for people to understand, that comes from us saying to the company, do you want to put that rated logo on your fact sheet or on your literature? And then that's where the revenue starts to come for us.
Okay, so there's that quant screen that all funds are assessed in, and if they pop out above that quant screen, it's then that they'll go into that qualitative process.
Yeah.
So let's delve more into that qualitative process. Is that whether or not you like the look of the fund manager or not? Tell us more about what you're looking for there.
Well, there are some elements of that. If you have, when you go and see a fund manager, and we always stipulate that a rated fund has to be looked at from a point of view of seeing the fund manager, then you do get an instant understanding of how a fund works, and you can actually test whether or not what's said in the marketing literature is actually what's going on in the fund. And we're very, very careful that when we first meet a fund manager, if it's a relatively new fund, that we don't simply think, oh well, that's great. That he or she has done a fantastic job in marketing to me, so therefore it should be a rated fund. We have to go back, look at the data again, recheck it, and then sometimes we wait until we see the evidence of that process that we've been told exists. And there are times when that changes. We've had funds that we've derated simply because the process has changed, over time. And we can notice that because we take notes when we first see them, we take notes when we second see them, we listen to conference calls, we listen to any information and data that we can get hold of related to that particular fund and manager, and then put that on top of what we already know. And if that's that process is changing, then we can look at re-evaluating the fund, or indeed if it's a new fund that we haven't rated, then we will look to rating that fund if we think it's proved its purpose.
I guess in support of the independence of your process, it's taken us 7 long years to get a Rayner Spencer Mills rating for the Verbatim funds, which finally we have, and we're very, very happy about that at Verbatim. However, it leads me on to asking the distinction between rating an individual fund, a single sector fund, for example, versus a range of funds that's more of a solution set, like the Verbatim funds, a risk-managed solution set. What's the distinction that you would have in process for that?
Well, we have a number of distinctions actually, Dan. We have a series of requirements that a rated range has to have. One of the things that halted the Verbatim range from being rated, for example, one of our criteria was that we needed to see that the fund manager and fund management range was run under the same process and concept. So whilst the overall underwriting, asset allocation from DT, risk profiling, etc., and the Verbatim range maintained that status quo across the range, at the initial stage of running them, they were all run by individual managers, and therefore that didn't qualify on our criteria. That criteria has now been overcome. The fund range, the growth range anyway, is all run by Lion Trust. Interestingly, from a Lion Trust perspective, we've known John Husselby and his team since way back in the 1990s when John started running multi-manager money. So that's something which influences. I didn't mention that earlier, but when you have an experienced fund manager like John, who's seen the up and downs of the market and is very, very strict about his processes, then that's really, really important for us, and I think that helps to overlay on top of anything else that we have from a qualitative perspective why we would rate a fund. So apart from the normal criteria of fund performance and the risk factors, then something like rating the Verbatim range is really down to the fact that we needed the consistency of manager across the piece, which we've now got. We needed the history of a fund manager. So if somebody new had come into that process and taken over the range, then we probably still wouldn't have rated it, because we would need the time frame to look at it. And
then it's about the delivery of performance against mandate.
Exactly, yeah. So in the case of the Verbatim range, we're talking about something which has an asset allocation, which we know is defined by a third party. That third party then provides information to the fund manager, in this case Liontrust, and the Liontrust then add their own tactical overlay to that, and we know what the margins and mandate does to stipulate what that will be. And then the returns we look at are those from the attribution are based on what are they adding from a tactical point of view, and then what are they adding from the underlying. So in the case of, again, it's the underlying fund selections, the consistency of process, the ability for us to contact them and provide us information. I mean, it's very, very easy to have a fund manager whose heads are in the clouds and won't provide information to you, in which case we wouldn't rate a fund where we don't get the information.
Okay. We've got a question at the end of the panel session with the fund managers that just didn't make it in time, but I think it's a good one to get your thoughts on. Came from John Phillips. Hi John, hope you're still with us. What do the panel think of what do you think of the FCA's view that fund management is far too costly? There's a need to reduce charges and make them more transparent. Is this something that you're looking at when you're researching funds?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it's not been as important in terms of how we look at funds from a point of view of returns, performance, risk, and the qualitative elements of philosophy and process, etc. That's our key. That's 80% of what we're doing. But we do look at the charges. I think it's important that from an FCA, sorry, as it is now called, point of view, that they are looking deeper into the industry and trying to balance the idea that this cost has got to be funded somewhere, and the funding at the moment is concealed to a certain extent. Within there is an OCF charge that we all understand and know, but that doesn't include all of the costs. So, including those that are not seen, such as the transactional costs, some of them, and obviously the cost of getting that research that the fund managers include in running the fund. So, it's really important that I think that clarity is there, and I think that movement is that pressure has been extenuated by the fact that we've got this big use of passive funds now, which are a lot cheaper. And those funds have done particularly well because of the way that markets have correlated over the last few years. And the individual advisors are starting to use them in greater amounts. So I think that pressure has been seen last week by the merger of Standard Life, well, the proposed merger of Standard Life and Aberdeen. There are two ways of looking at it. You cut your costs, or you create scale. That's a creation of scale, I think. So I think that pressure that's been put forward will naturally find its way in the market. You can't really argue, I don't think, with the regulator in terms of what they're thinking of doing. So that's a positive from that sense, and I think those margins will come in. It might be slower than people think they will, but for the active management industry to compete with the passive management industry, then that's something which is going to have to happen, I think. And
in terms of rating the passive market, do you think that it's a similar process, or is it a different quant and qual process that you'd have?
It's a slightly different qualitative process because clearly we're not looking at an individual manager. We are looking at a process, but that process is fairly well defined. There's only several, 2 or 3 ways of doing that, and I think that basically, if you understand that, then you know that. And there are only so many people going to enter that market. You know there are 4 or 5 providers out there at the moment. Your BlackRocks, your Vanguards, HSBC, etc. Legal and General, probably the ones that most people know of. There are very few new entrants to that. I think arguably one came a couple of years ago with Fidelity, bringing in a new index proposition, but that was again based on a US model. So the chances of us seeing new entrants in that space are very limited. However, what you will get, and I think what's greying the areas at the moment, is smart beta. There's a lot of choice within the passive industry to select a fund which is has got a small cap value, or it's got certain things excluded from it, or etc. etc. So what we're ending up doing is having an active management industry that's creating alpha and a passive management industry that's moving more towards active. What are Vanguard doing at the moment? They're bringing in active funds. It's to the UK, that is. They already have them in the US. So we are seeing a strange amalgamation of the two, which will be very interesting to see whether price determines whether people buy or whether performance does. A
couple of quick questions. Stuart Lockhart's trying to poke the ginger bear with this one, Stuart. Why do you not rate the Verbatim Income Fund?
Ah, I see, okay. Well, the Verbatim Income Fund, again, is run in a slightly different premise and basis, and what we wanted to do was look at the consistency of profile across a range, so it's a rated range. The Income Fund has always been within it, but not part of it, if you see what I mean. So it's done on a separate basis, and it's not run under the same mandate and not by the same manager, so that's the reason.
Okay, and there's a question here. Anonymous question says that an advisor here, I've utilised the research expertise of Rayner Spencer Mills through advisory models that have been made available through SimplyBiz. Recently begun outsourcing the responsibility of managing these. I've looked at these model portfolio service offering discretionary Rayner Spencer Mills models available through Verbatim. With an ever-increasing focus on cost from the FCA, how do these models differ from the advisory models, and what added value does it offer your clients for an extra layer of cost?
The discretionary models are built around or have an ability to have a greater tactical manipulation, if you like. So, because we can act on those in a relatively rapid way. The models that started off under the SimplyBiz banner and under the Verbatim banner are more strategic. They were set up to be less traded so that they could last longer, if you like, in the format that they were in. So that's the main difference. And some of the funds in there you'll see are different simply because we haven't really gone about changing those as much as we don't want to create that kind of turbulence within a set of portfolios and create all the issues that a non-discretionary portfolios can create. The discretionary side of the portfolios, which I think now has got to be a sensible way of approaching using the models, has a more hands-on approach in the sense that we can be slightly more tactical because we can get changes through much more quickly. Particularly for the individual advisor, and I think that's where the cost difference is in that sort of ability to manipulate them.
Okay, Ken, thank you very much indeed. Time has flown by on us. Ladies and gentlemen, we have got some sessions coming up on pensions regulation, on the defined benefits market, and what the latest musings are from the FCA. And in order to tee up those sessions, last week I caught up with the chairman of the SimplyBiz group, Mr. Ken Davey, and I asked him his thoughts on all of those different topics and the state of the market for financial advisory businesses overall. So what we've got next is 15 minutes or so of TV Gold with none other than Mr. Ken Davey. Run VT. Ken, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us, we've just sat through the budget. What are your thoughts on the key aspects from an advisor's point of view?
Well, Dan, it's a pleasure, and thanks for Franz for asking me. My key thoughts on the budget, really it's not a non-event, but it's a very much a steady as she goes. There's been no significant changes, but a lot of minor steps in different directions and a couple of steps back. So my overall view at this stage is that it's a steady as she goes budget. I wouldn't quite say batten down the hatches, which has been one implication because of all the concerns about Brexit, but certainly something that is not going to fundamentally alter any of the way in which we work, I don't think.
And some of the key provisions, particularly from a tax planning and a pensions perspective, are still intact, and that's good news for advisors.
Well, it's the things that didn't happen. You could say higher rate tax is still available on up to £40,000 of contribution, which is really quite remarkable when you consider that we got within an ace of it being squashed 2 years ago. Perhaps longer. And the other thing was inheritance taxes. That was really flagged up as being likely to be increased this year, particularly to fund social care and that sort of thing. And again, nothing happened. So it's almost as if they've decided that it's not worth making any material changes at this stage. Let's get Brexit out of the way and then see where we go from there.
Okay. What are your thoughts on, there's been the recent announcements around lifetime ISAs. I don't know if you have any thoughts as to how you would be exploring that if you were an advisor.
Well, I think lifetime ISAs, they're obviously an opportunity for the younger savers up to, I think it's 40. But frankly, I believe there's going to be a lot of misbuying of ISAs because the lifetime ISA has so many ways that you can be caught out in cashing it and pay extra penalties, which certainly won't be anticipated by the person who starts to save, because you get your 25% uplift, but only providing that you operate it in a certain way. And so I think there's going to be a few people who will get their fingers burnt. So as an advisor, I think it's critically important that if you are going to use the LISA, that you make sure your client fully understands the implications. And I would make sure that that's in the suitability letter or the follow-up correspondence, because there needs to be evidence that they were told what the penalties were. It isn't any good just leaving it to the company's literature that you happen to be using. And of course, there's not a lot of choice either at this stage.
Indeed, yeah. Okay. Some of our regular viewers and the members of the SimplyBiz fraternity out there will know that every now and then you like to put forth your views on what the good and the great at the regulator are up to. What's your thoughts on the current direction of travel from the regulator?
I think there's some really interesting things happening at the FCA. There's lots of things that we could pick holes in, but the most significant recent announcement has been the one about the senior managers regime being extended to all sectors of the financial community, including the advice firms. That's really important, and it's going to have a massive implication, because what it means is that if you are a person of importance or trust in a business, so a one-man business, it's you. A four-man business, there's usually somebody got the responsibility. They're going to be personally liable for not errors and omissions as such, but for bad behaviour. Yeah. And now this was brought in and to be directed at the banks, because what they found when the banks in the credit crisis had behaved so abysmally that they found it impossible to actually pin the responsibility on individuals, with the result that, yes, the banks were fined massive amounts, but the real culprits, the management, got off pretty well scot-free. Not in every case, but pretty well. And so the senior managers regime means that every responsible task in a business, a financial services business, has to have exactly that, somebody responsible for it. You can't keep passing the buck. Somebody ultimately has to be responsible for it. Now, the important thing for advisors and why this is going to be a real plus for the sector rather than negative is that we're all fed up with paying FSCS levies. Yeah. And we know the FSCS is being reviewed, and we might talk about that in a moment. But one of the things that causes the levies are the actions of the careless, the reckless, and the downright criminal. And they do these things, whether it's pension transfers or whatever it happens to be, SASs and frauds. They do all these things, and they get away. They fold the firm up, and the firm shuts, and they get away pretty well scot-free. And indeed, as some of us have seen, they then phoenix again and re-emerge. Under this legislation, in these regulations, that won't happen to the same extent, because they will be personally liable and personally responsible for the actions of the firm. Because let's face it, a firm isn't an abstract piece of junk. No. A firm is the sum of its parts, and it's the individuals within the business that decide the direction of it, what risks they're going to take, and all of that. And these proposals, which are going to be consulted on in the not too distant future, those proposals are going to put the responsibility firmly on individuals. Now, from an advisor's point of view and from the financial services arena that we work in point of view, that's a good thing, because that is undoubtedly going to reduce over time the levies on the FSCS. Whatever happens to the new funding model, there's going to be much less irresponsible, criminal and reckless behaviour. Particularly the first and last, reckless and careless behaviour. So that has to be a good thing for all of us.
So that's a tick in the box in terms of the direction of travel around the senior persons regime. You published your response to the consultation around the compensation scheme. What do you think the chances that your wish list had come true?
Will it be? I don't think they'll meet my requirements entirely.
Right. So could you summarise what for anybody who hadn't picked up on what it was you were proposing?
The proposal is that you have to look at the problem. Dan. So the problem is that the IFAs or financial advisors generally are picking up the bill for things over things that they have absolutely no control of. They have no control over it. So if somebody is doing something in Aberdeen, the chances of someone in the same office in Aberdeen knowing what's going on is virtually nil. For someone in Bodmin to know what's going on is impossible. So they have no knowledge, no ability to stop it, no ability to influence it. So there's absolutely nothing they can do about it, and yet financial advisors are picking up the bill, and that is just completely wrong. It is the term I've used. It's a grotesque unfairness. So you then have to look at, if you're going to change it, well, you have to look at, well, who does know what's going on? Well, of course, the regulator knows what's going on, but the regulator isn't going to pay because it will only be coming from the financial services sector anyway. So the next are product providers. The reality is that product providers have a much greater awareness of what's going on in the marketplace than financial advisors can ever have. Indeed, in terms of transfer on pensions and so on, they actually write out the checks, so they know what's going where. And so I believe there's a real opportunity for them to be brought into the contribution, into making contributions to the FSCS. And the regulator has indicated that they're minded to do that as well. What they have put forward are one or two suggestions for relatively modest contributions, and I'm arguing that the contribution should be much higher and that it should be the dominant amount going into the FSCS. We talked a moment or two about other things that will, I think, ultimately reduce the FSCS overall, and that's good for everybody, which is the senior managers regime. However, by bringing the product providers into making contributions, I think that will focus their minds on spotting the problems earlier. I'm sure we've all got stories of things that product providers have told us after an event. Oh, we thought something funny was going on there. Well, now I think they'll have a vested interest, hopefully, in making sure that things are stopped earlier. So if things be stopped earlier, that will reduce the cost and certainly put the burden of the FSCS, which for the product providers overall, and we've done some numbers on this, that it's a tiny proportion of the premiums they receive, and therefore will have, in my view, no material impact on any individual company, but it will spread it. Now, what I'm sure is going to continue is that financial advisors and financial advice firms will continue to have to make a contribution. And you can see the logic in that, because the fact that the compensation system exists does benefit the overall financial advice sector. A bit like ABTA benefits the travel agency in business. So we do get some sort of halo effect. What we shouldn't be doing is paying the whole of the cost, which is what we do at the moment, and which, as I say again, is grotesquely unfair.
Okay. What since RDR, there's been a continual discussion about the terminology used to describe advice and advice definitions. What are your thoughts about the regulator's current direction of travel in this area?
Well, that's interesting, Dan, because there is a working party supposedly looking at this at the moment, which has been drawn essentially from the sector. includes in particular a number of quite well-known restricted advice firms. So we wait with bated breath really to see what emerges. I don't suppose anybody is really keen on the term restricted, but having said that, you do have to differentiate between independent financial advice and restricted advice, and because there are a whole range of implications that come with it, and so we'll have to wait and see what happens, but I do believe it's likely we will see some change.
Okay. And what are your thoughts generally about the state of health of the financial advisory market, and in particular the small to medium-sized financial advisory business?
Well, the firms that we serve in SimplyBiz and Compliance First and CIFA are really doing well. All the feedback we're getting is incredibly positive. Obviously, it doesn't. There's always some that are not doing quite as well, but I think since the RDR and Pharma, we are seeing that there isn't a shortage of clients, it's a shortage of time to see them. And so, as you well know, Dan, we at SimplyBiz and the group as a whole, we're doing quite a number of things to help save advisors time. And last year and the year before, I and my director colleagues spent quite a bit of time having lunch and dinner with various firms that we serve to try and establish what the real needs were. And time again, it came back as being help us get more time. So I think some of the things we're doing on refining compliance and some of the things that we're anticipating the FCA will do in terms of refining and simplifying the processes as far as compliance is concerned, I think that will help.
Yeah.
But more than anything, the incorporating technology, not robo-advice, because robo-advice is a misnomer. Robots don't give advice. But the new definition of advice, that's it has to be a personal recommendation to an individual or a family or whatever. That, I think, is going to help clarify it and ensure that the firms that we serve are able to incorporate technology, and the new websites that we've launched, which have got interactive capability and so on, they're really terrific, and they're going to just be enhanced almost month by month in the coming 2 years. So don't quite hold me to month, but certainly on a regular basis. And so what that is going to enable advisors to do is to still give that personal service, but have a lot of the jobs and tasks done by technology, and in fact done by the client themselves through technology. We all know now if we want to book a holiday or anything, we do most of the work ourselves because we're working on the internet, and we put in the information and so on. So that's what people take for granted now. What they need still at the end of that is the personal service. And you can do that by visiting them and putting your arm around their shoulder, or you can do it by Skype or FaceTime, and again give them that personal service. So within SimplyBiz and the firms that we serve as a group, we believe that financial advisors will have an unfair advantage over the so-called robo-advisors, because they will be able to combine the best of both worlds, the best of their personal service, which is what they're doing now and why they're so busy and so successful, and combine it with the best of technology, so that there's the right balance between technology and personal service to save the maximum time in giving the advice, but to deliver the very best results for the clients. That's what we all want to see.
Great. Ken, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We'll get back to live in the studio.
It's a pleasure.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. That was Ken Davey. I tell you what, with enthusiasm and passion like that, that young man will go far. Thank you for sticking with us and joining us for this next session. We're going to focus on regulation. Coming up in about 11:45, we're going to focus specifically on pensions legislation, take a look at the budget with Steve Webb of Royal London and John Lawson from Aviva. But in advance of that, I've got none other than the Jose Mourinho of compliance policy at the SimplyBiz Group. It's Richard Nuttall, Head of Compliance Policy. Ricky, tell us, what are the good folk at the FCA currently got their BDI on that advisors should be most thinking about?
Well, first of all, thanks for that kind introduction, Dan. I have to say, it was fantastic listening to Ken just now. That level of experience and knowledge and intelligence, and kind of feel like I've been brought on to balance that level of intelligence out. But do you know what? You'd expect me to say that I just agree with everything that he said, and do you know what I do? You know, I really believe that. I think he's touched upon some of the real key issues that are going to affect advisory firms throughout the course of this year. What Ken does so eloquently is explain everything at a high level. My role and what I do within SimplyBiz is to try and apply that to firms and what it means on a more day-to-day approach. And you take some of those areas which Ken's touched upon, so for example, the senior managers regime.
Yeah, come on, give us the real practical details and issues around this.
Well, first of all, the senior manager regime saying to me that first of all that the approved persons regime didn't actually work in practice because we saw many problems, not within the smaller firms, but within the larger organisations. So we're starting to see a change. Now, I hope it's going to have very little effect on the smaller firms, the typical firms that we look to serve within the SimplyBiz group. Now, at the moment in time, we don't know, because we're expecting a consultation. We'll have that out this year, we'll look at it, we'll analyse it, we'll try to understand all the responsibilities that firms will have as a result, and then what we'll do, we'll publish information and full guidance and support at that particular time. But I do believe that for the vast majority, they will not be affected directly by this new approach, but I do believe it will have some positive effects within the marketplace itself. So, I totally agree with Ken. This is a really positive thing that is coming out, and not something that the smaller firms have to worry about. In terms of worrying, you've got other areas such as, well, Ken mentioned lifetime ISAs. And it always worries me when I go into the bank, and I know these aren't launched, these haven't been launched yet, but when I go into the bank and they're not putting something under my nose, or there's no signposts, or someone behind a counter is not trying to sort of influence my investments in these sorts of products, it always worries me, because if the big banks aren't touching them, then it's a concern. What I would like to know is the advisor view. Is there a need, is there a demand that we start to publish further guidance and support in these particular areas? Whether firms will want to give advice because they're so complex, I'm not too sure. Okay,
well, you've got your trigger fingers at the ready. Send us your thoughts, questions, and just generally what you think about the lifetime ISA market. If you get those in straight away, then Ricky and I can chew the fat on them and debate them. Also, any questions around any aspect of the current regulatory environment that we can answer for you. What's the lay of the land at the moment from a suitability of investment advice perspective that advisors should be keeping their eye on? Over the course of the last 4 years, we've had different tablets of stone laid out of thematic reviews and finalised guidance. What's the real practical implications for day-to-day advice at the moment?
Well, what's really interesting recently is we've had a couple of pieces of guidance out which looks at the ongoing suitability of portfolios. We've had the general review of suitability reports, and that's been through the assessing suitability assessment, which touched upon in the region of about 700 firms, which was quite a large exercise. It was pretty much as large as anything I've seen in my time, representing about 5% of the advice market. And think what we're going to see from this, after we've had the initial feedback to individual firms, and some of it is questionable. You know, we can see areas where firms can improve and develop what they do in terms of the disclosure and the suitability that they're providing to firms. On the other hand as well, we see where perhaps the regulator may not be aligned to our particular thinking. So it's really important, if a firm has been involved in our assessment, that they do liaise with us and we can help and support them through that process. Well, I think what we're going to start to see build from that is more guidance now to suitability. And certainly makes me nervous, because it was only last year we rewrote all our suitability reports. And what we don't want to be doing is having to rewrite them as a result of future feedback that we're going to get following this assessment. The ultimate intention is, from all this, is to reduce the amount of information that we're providing to clients.
So is it more detail, less detail? What is there a rule of thumb around the suitability report?
It's less detail, but it's making it relevant to the individual needs, because, and I'm sure this is going to be fed out within the suitability assessment which has been carried out, that a lot of times clients are getting information which is not personalised to them. It's just general information, and the regulator doesn't like it. It has to be personalised and appropriate to the needs of that particular client. And that makes it very, very difficult to have sort of these template structures. A template structure, when we produce the reports, is to look at the key information that goes within there, but it's still a big time demand for advisors. Now, the more information you provide to someone, the less inclined they are to actually read it. So one of the things that we've done is, in reviewing our reports, is to actually try and reduce that level of information, but really make it relevant to the individual. And we've got these other regulatory guidance coming out in the form of smarter communications, which is looking at exactly that. When we're providing information, we need to be clearer, and it needs to be it just needs to be reduced. I think we get so bogged down with overloading information, and it does come from a point of view that it's there to protect the firm, but it seems to be having the opposite effect. So almost too much information is going to have sort of a negative effect on their sort of future.
The advisors are starting to send their questions in for us, which is good. Jane Hodges is back in touch again. Jane, keep it coming. Our industry is full of fearful advisors trying to move back from advice and liability. How can we make advisors more confident? Guidance is vital to the future, so how can we grasp it? Is this something you see genuinely? Let's challenge the assumption Jane's made that this is an industry full of fearful advisors trying to move back from advice and liability.
One of the most pleasing things that I've seen recently is the Treasury get involved in the area of financial services, looking at the wider landscape through the Financial Advice Market Review, FAMA. And as part of that, they've looked at the definition of advice. And what we're going to have now, from the introduction of MiFID II, so from the beginning of next year, we're going to have a new definition of advice. And this is really important, because at the moment in time, advice can be very, very generic indeed, but still branded as advice. Now, to actually understand what advice is, you have to look within the depths of the regulatory handbook to understand it. It's very, very difficult for the industry to understand what is advice. It's impossible for the consumer.
It's a good job you keep a copy of this on your bedside table, so fill us in.
Well, it's essentially going to be changing, and advice will be a personal recommendation. And that means all this robo-advice or guidance, whatever you want to call it, will no longer be able to be badged up as advice, because to give advice to someone, you have to ensure it's suitable for their personal circumstances, not just information which could capture generic circumstances about a whole range of individuals. So it's really going to bring advice to the fore. It will be an awful lot more bespoke than it is at the moment in time. And I really do believe that the value of that will be echoed right throughout the whole, not just the industry, but throughout all consumers as well. And don't get me wrong, I've got nothing against these automated services. I think there's a need for it. I think, you know, people do need to start saving more, and at times they don't need advice when they're getting on the ladder. And where they will need it is where they have started to sort of save more sizable amounts, where it becomes really important. Now, what I mean by that is, if we get the products right at the outset, then, you know, whatever they go into shouldn't really make too much of a difference. You know, you'll still have that regulatory aspect behind the product manufacturing, but what really comes to the fore then is advice, because that personal recommendation.
And what do you think the future is for the term restricted? Will that still be on part of the landscape?
Well, we know it is. We know when we get MiFID II that it will be independent and it will be restricted. So there might be a little play with some of the terminology, but essentially we are going to have that landscape as we have it at the moment in time, but with a subtle difference when it comes to independence. Because, mentioned before, MiFID II, when that comes in beginning of next year, the definition of independence will be a little bit more flexible. So it won't be the consideration of every single retail investment product, which we have to consider at the moment in time. So firms will be able to offer advice which is a little bit more targeted in range of products, but still be independent. And I think that's a good thing.
And when you talk about range of products, you mean in terms of, like, if my investment advice was, is that at a tax wrapper level? Is that at a fund level? How's that positioned?
It's still looking at a range of funds. It's still looking at a range of providers. It's still looking at platform versus off-platform, but it's been able to condense the product range.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to be investment only, if someone wants to be pension only, if someone doesn't want, as I say, don't want to consider every retail investment product because at times they think they're far too complex, they're too high risk, not appropriate for their target market.
Is that even a realistic possibility? Isn't comparing the whole of the relevant market for every client a Sisyphean task that just can't be completed anyway?
Well, it's about the knowledge. It's about the knowledge behind it, isn't it? It's about the understanding of everything which is out there. And sometimes that's the biggest barrier than the actual consideration, because one of the things that we did at the onset of RDR was to have the enhanced suitability questionnaire, which kind of went through a paper exercise to discount a whole range of solutions which simply wouldn't be relevant to consumers. But it seems daft to having to go through that paper exercise just to recommend what you fundamentally know. So your hope is that in the new world order going forward with MiFID II, that notion of considering the whole of the relevant market will be... It will simplify the process. Right. It will free more time up and more resource for advisors, which ultimately is what we're trying to achieve at the moment in time through a whole range of different areas. And, you know, advisors will still need the knowledge to discount, but they won't have to sort of have a documented process on every single client file. Okay. John Rand has been in touch. Thank you, John. He wants to know what you mentioned around suitability reports. He accepts the FCA seem to be saying they should be shorter but personalised. Whilst he agrees, he's also worried about his PI insurer, making sure that he does everything to satisfy them with the information given to the client. And his question is, can both be satisfied? Well, it's the key concern. I think what people have is not always the regulator, it is the PI insurer, but also the compensation scheme as well. And this is why it's so important that it is not just the FCA having a review, it is also the compensation scheme and the Ombudsman as well, because sometimes it's the decisions that they take through information not being on file. And often we read stories where the Ombudsman has decided an outcome which is favourable with the client because of information not being on file, and it makes people nervous. And they read these headline statements and it makes them think, well, do you know what, it's better to include everything than miss out one piece of information. And then from that, what we get is effectively a replication sometimes of key features information. Now, the FCA are working closely with the Ombudsman and advice firms at the moment in time to try and have a better understanding of what it is needed.
That's interesting, because
suitability
one
reports.
of the common conceptions around the advisory community seems to be that the regulator, the Ombudsman, and the compensation scheme are acting entirely in isolation of each other, and that one is not interpreting the legislation in the same way. Is that something that would you agree with that statement?
I think I'd be minded to agree with it. I think they do have different objectives at the end of the day, and that's just which is mandated to them. So you can understand that. I do think there needs to be a closer relationship between the regulator and the Ombudsman, but I also think as well that the Ombudsman needs to be sort of sharing more information in terms of how they reach their outcomes. Yes, we get regular newsletters, but it doesn't really give any meaningful insight as to how they're taking these decisions, which have big impacts and ramifications in terms of the wider advice market. And it's essentially that which has led to these levels of information which is provided to the consumer,
right,
of which you have to feel sorry for.
Yeah.
Because no one at a consumer level could be expected to understand and apply the level of information in these letters. And that's what the regulators are trying to do, quite rightly so. Reduce information, keep it more relevant to personal circumstances, so it's better for the consumer. Can we achieve it? We'll hope so. It's what we're trying to working to achieve. And it is quite interesting, as we have launched these, we do speak to a lot of people, and there's an awful lot of nervousness about using these shorter reports, because they like the information there. They feel it is their security blanket when it goes in. So this is not just about education for the regulator, the Ombudsman. It's about advice firms as well. And of course, we're learning. As soon as we get the information, we have to try and understand it and interpret it, and then share that with firms in a way in which we hope is understandable to them.
Great. Well, it's good to know that you've got your finger on the pulse. Thank you very much, Richard. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to have a run around, rearrange the deck chairs, and when we come back, we're going to get stuck into post-budget pension legislation and defined benefits for the next hour with a pension special. See you in just a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.